friends, it's your old pal Jordan the Lion. How are you all doing today? I hope you said great. I'm doing great. Today we're coming to you from, as you can see, Debbie Reynolds' home in Las Vegas, Nevada. And I was thinking, let's go visit one of her co-stars' graves today, the great Tony Curtis. They were in The Rat Race and Goodbye Charlie together. I'm staying here with Todd Fisher, who has his own interesting Tony Curtis stories, but Tony was an absolute legend. And I think he deserves to be remembered. So we're gonna go out and pay our respects to him. And he made Las Vegas, Henderson, Nevada was kind of like his adopted hometown. So a lot of people are, that I talk to, are always kind of surprised he's buried out here. But yeah, not in Hollywood, he's buried in Las Vegas. Let's go see him. Daze with Jordan the Lion and you all begins now. Do you want to go visit Tony Curtis? I guess so. You want to go with me? There's a sign for Henderson. That's where Tony lived out here for several years. Last years of his life. Yes, here we are back at Palm Eastern Memorial Gardens. We're just here talking about Pat Morita being cremated here and Red Fox being buried here. Tony Curtis is also buried here. I visited Mr. Curtis here once before. Seems like it was on the back side of these. Then if we walk just up this path, you can see all the stones and some flowers. The bench says Shiloh, a place of peace. Emmanuel Schwartz, Helen Schwartz, Julia Schwartz, Robert Schwartz, Evelyn Bowman, says on top of that bench. Those were his family members, the Schwartzes. Emmanuel was his father, Helen was his mother, Julius was his younger brother by 4 years, and then Robert was considerably younger. Here is the grave of Tony Curtis. You can see he's got that horseshoe cross. And there it says, Tony Curtis, born Bernard Schwartz, June 3rd, 1925. I believe there's a quarter over top of that, so it could be 1923. Died September 29th, 2010. And he was always quietly arrayed, and he was always human when he talked, but still he fluttered pulses when he said good morning, and he glittered when he walked. It's a nice, calm, peaceful gravesite. Tony Curtis certainly had a very rough life growing up. His mother was undiagnosed schizophrenic and was very verbally and physically abusive to him. She used to beat him and his younger brother Julius pretty badly. He said it took him years to recover from this, and they would tell him when he was young that he was responsible for Julius, and so he was kind of like his younger brother's keeper, and Julius would end up, when Bernard was just a teenager, ended up getting hit by a car, and his parents made Bernard, Tony, go and identify the body. He definitely did not come from a well-to-do family either. He didn't have it easy. He was born to a Hungarian immigrants, and the first 5 years of his life he only spoke Hungarian. He was Jewish, and he was bullied for that for part of his life, and then when he was a young man, he was starting to get into trouble with local kids with stealing things or whatnot, and one of his neighbors sent him off, paid for him to go to a Boy Scout camp. And Tony always said that was kind of what turned him into like a good person. He kind of got on the up and up and after that. But when he was in high school, he got into his first play, decided he liked theater, and he loved the movies. He was a big fan of Cary Grant. And when World War II broke out, he forged his mother's signature, and Bernard Schwartz joined up with the Navy. I guess he was so excited to go and help that he had requested to be on a submarine or on a ship, and he was kind of disappointed that they put him on like a supply ship, but he was actually there, and I believe they said within binocular distance actually could see Japan surrender and sign the treaty to end World War II. When he came home, he used the GI Bill to go to acting school and ended up in a play called Golden Boy and got discovered. Got himself a Universal contract. He was in classes with, once he got that contract, with people like Rock Hudson, and that's where he changed his name from Bernard Schwartz to Tony Curtis. The Curtis came from, I guess, his mother's side. Her last name, or one of the family names, was Kurtz, so he decided to go with Curtis. He was, one of the things I love about him is, didn't take him long being in things. I think he got his contract in 48. They started putting him in films in 49. We recently just were out in Kanab, Utah, where he filmed his very first picture. They had a plaque out there for that. But he was in Winchester 73 with my pal Shelley Winters, and started getting so much fan mail from that that they had to start starring him, giving him chances to be a star in his own pictures. And I, of course, loved him in Some Like It Hot, Operation Petticoat, Spartacus. Great actor. Had a pretty good career, too. He was a great leading man for comedies, but did a lot of stuff. In fact, I mentioned the stuff he did with Debbie Reynolds. But after a while, he ended up falling in love early on in his career with Janet Leigh. And the studio was kind of like, he had an up-and-coming career. They were kind of telling him not to get too close to her, not to marry her. And he wanted to, so they went off and eloped, with Jerry Lewis being actually the witness to their wedding. And then they had 2 kids, one of which being Jamie Lee Curtis, who's a pretty well-known actress in her own right. And unfortunately, even though they were paired up in movies together, Janet Leigh and Tony Curtis, they were kind of trying to take advantage of the publicity of them getting married.
Oh, go on if you're gonna make a fool of yourself. Go on.
Here.
After several years, their marriage just didn't work out, and Tony ended up having several wives. I believe he was married 5 times. They told him when he married Janet that would hurt his career, and it really didn't. But then when he married his 18-year-old German co-star, after he divorced, basically what he did was he filed for divorce without telling Janet. She was filming The Manchurian Candidate and found out through the radio that he had filed. And so as soon as the divorce was finished, Janet actually got remarried the day after the divorce was finalized, and he married his 18-year-old co-star in his most recent picture. And it seemed like basically his career started to go downhill. His fans kind of turned on him until he decided to do something dramatic, like as far as a dramatic role, and starred in The Boston Strangler and got great reviews for that.
What did you see?
Woman's breasts.
Whose?
I don't know. Her blouse came off in my hand.
Albert, now.
And actually preparing for one of his roles, he started using cocaine, not thinking that he would ever get addicted to it, and just trying to get in character. He's a method actor, and he developed a pretty hard addiction to cocaine for a while. He said that made him hard to be around with some of his wives, and he ended up having several injuries throughout his life and everything. But you notice down here on his headstone there's several horses. His last marriage, he basically, he had something similar to what my friend Shelley Winters had happened to her when I met her. Literally the same thing. They both got pneumonia. Because of the pneumonia, they ended up going into a coma, Because of that, they ended up not being able to walk and had to rehabilitate themselves, relearn how to walk and talk and everything. And while he was going through this process, he found out that his wife was, he heard her crying, saw that she was reading about these abused horses, and that these horses were basically being raised just to be slaughtered for glue or for dog food. And he vowed to save these horses, as many as he could, for her, or because they both loved horses. And they ended up opening a ranch called the Shiloh Ranch, which I believe, you know, that's why I was like, oh, that's kind of cool that that bench says Shiloh on it, a place of peace, because that's what he named the horse ranch. Vested a lot of money into that. In the 80s, he really got heavy into painting and was a really, really good painter. Spent most of his life after that painting just about every day. He even said when he would get to points where he lost interest in being an actor, always loved to paint, never lost interest in that. A couple of controversial things about him. One was he never won an Academy Award, never won an Oscar. He was nominated, and for all the great things he did, he never won one. That did upset him. He never really could understand why, even though he got a Lifetime Achievement Award and had a star on the Walk of Fame, he never got that Oscar. But what also was kind of interesting was that the last year of his life, he ended up changing his will and cutting all of his children out of the will. On July 8th of 2010, he was doing a book signing in Henderson, Nevada, and that's actually where he was making his home, and ended up having a major asthma attack and ended up going into the hospital, and then just a couple of months later ended up passing away of cardiac arrest at his home in Henderson. Here he lies eternally. I was surprised to read that that he had dated Marilyn Monroe before they were both anybody, and that you would think because of that it would have made them working on Some Like It Hot much easier. In fact, he said that she was so nervous on the set, it took her like 43 takes for just one simple 3-word piece of dialogue. Supposed to say, "It's me, sugar," and she kept messing it up. And he said that she, working with Jack Lemmon was actually a pleasure, but he said working with her was very difficult during that time. And I do know Jack Lemmon actually wasn't their first choice for that character. They originally wanted Frank Sinatra, but then the director just decided that Frank was too much trouble and decided to go with lovable Jack Lemmon instead, which I think was a better choice. Jack Lemmon's amazing in this. Rest in peace, Tony Curtis. One of my favorite Tony Curtis stories was he said when he was in the military, they only had like one movie they could watch, and so they got to know the movie so well they would turn the volume off and each guy would pick a character and do their voice, and he would always do Cary Grant. That's how he got so good at doing Cary Grant's voice, so he could do it when he did his character in Some Like It Hot. Talk like this.
Certainly not. With all the unrest in the world, I don't think anybody should have a yacht that sleeps more than 12.
I quite agree.
Shoot, Tony Curtis was impressive enough that young Elvis Presley used to have pictures of him up on his wall as a young boy. So we're back at Todd Fisher's house, and there's Debbie Reynolds' autograph collection. She collected autographs from people she worked with, just her being a fan, and she has one over here signed to her from Tony Curtis. Let me show you. There you go. That is, I believe, them in the Rat Race, and he inscribed it, "Harry, I'm sorry, but Debbie and I have something we have to tell you. Affectionately, Tony." Harry was Harry Carl. That was Debbie's husband. Alright, so as I kind of teased, I'm staying with Todd Fisher, and Todd is Debbie Reynolds' son, and I thought, you know, Debbie has made several movies with Tony. Maybe Todd would have a story or something about knowing Tony Curtis or meeting Tony Curtis, so.
Well, when I first met Tony Curtis on the set of this movie, The Rat Race.
Nice.
And this was a kind of a dramatic movie, but at the same time, you know, it's hard to take the two of them seriously entirely. I mean, Tony Curtis, obviously great comedy. My mom, great comedy. And then Don Rickles plays sort of a major supporting role. And so it's hard to take them too seriously. But that was drama for them. And then, of course, they made Goodbye Charlie. And that, I think, was their best movie together. And, I mean, they're very charismatic together. Right at that time, they were both the right age, and it was a pretty good match. But, of course, they were both married.
Yeah, I found an 8x10 that was made out to Harry Carl. It says, "To Harry, Debbie and I are in love," or something. "We're leaving you."
Well, there's teasing, of course.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, so Tony Curtis was always joking around, but I didn't know him like super well, but we did sort of grow up around his children, Jamie and the kids, and you know, there was a little bit of interaction on the sets and shared babysitting activities during filming, these kinds of things. But the best Tony Curtis, you can't top the New York City story for Tony Curtis. When we moved to New York, went to 154 East 74th Street, and right across the street, Tony Curtis was living. So my mother was doing a play called Irene, and Tony was working on another show. I don't know what it was. But my mother says, like, I'd only been there a little while, and she says, "Oh, we're going to go over to Tony's house across the street." I said, "Oh, that's cool, whatever." And we all go over to Tony Curtis's house, and I have my buddy Richard Landers with me, and Carrie was there. And we went into the house, we're walking around just checking out his pad, and he comes over to me at a certain point, and he goes, puts his arm around my shoulder, and he goes, puts a couple of joints in my top pocket. I had a shirt with the top of the he goes, "Don't go to strangers." And I was like, he's just assuming that we're going to go score weed somewhere, which we weren't really thinking about at that exact moment. But, you know, it's pretty cool having Tony Curtis give you a couple of joints, I suppose. You know, I wouldn't mind that. And you know, then over time, my mother would have her wine, and Tony would have his marijuana cigarettes. So that was sort of a funny interconnect. This is back when it's still a felony to smoke a joint in New York.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
This is not exactly like today. Not that, I don't know that anybody, you know, you go back even further and you have Robert Mitchum and people getting arrested for some pot. How absurd is that? Anyway, Tony Curtis was just this very charismatic guy, really sweet guy. He eventually
and offered to be your basically your marijuana hookup.
Yeah, and you know what was funny is that we would go over and reciprocate, you know, and he would say, well, you know, he would look at, he was sort of an aficionado. I mean, this is long before I saw anybody like smelling and squeezing buds and going, ooh, look at the hair, look, that's got the orange hairs on. I mean, there was really not a lot of that going on in my world. I just had come from California where all we had was Mexican pot. New York, you know, had a whole nother scale. It was the first place I ever saw Colombian pot and Panama Red and the esoteric pot, which today is commonplace. You go to a store, there's 100 things to choose from. But back then, you know, he was really into it.
Was he known in Hollywood like that? I mean, because I always knew Robert Mitchum, of course, but
no, I don't know that he was. I mean, it would. No, I don't think so. Not that I would have been tuned into the adult drug who's doing what.
Yeah.
There were people, obviously, that were talked about in Hollywood that had drug issues, and he was certainly not one of them.
Yeah.
So no, I don't think that was it. I mean, it's just when you're 15 years old and your mother, you know, is sitting there in the living room having her wine and he's smoking a joint. Carrie and I come running downstairs because the smell is wafting upstairs in the brownstone. You know, it was like, we were like, wow, what's that? And then we were like looking at our mom like, you know what he's smoking over there? I mean, you know, that was the early stages.
Did you think that Debbie was kind of naive to what that smell was or whatever?
She was. It's not a think. My mother was, you know, the Woody Allen movie where he sneezes in the cocaine?
Yeah.
That's my mother. She was always very naive to all that. You know, that image that she has is not some trumped up image. I mean, she really had 27 merit badges. She is and was and always will be a Girl Scout. I mean, you know, that's just the way it was. She never really, and then when we tried to get her to smoke pot, in around that time, even with Tony. You know, she would go.
Oh, never inhale it?
Like, no. You see, in order to have the effect, you have to actually inhale. And she'd do it again, still not doing it. And Tony would just go, oh,
that's great.
Forget it. We're not even gonna get her to try. But he used to try to get her to smoke with him, but she would always do the same thing. And she smoked cigarettes like that too. When she did the movie Mary Mary, they taught her to smoke. And if you watch her smoking in that movie, she doesn't inhale.
That's crazy.
It's the same kind of thing. She never quite figured all that out. It was cute. That's the naive Debbie side.
Thank you for sharing a story. I mean, you know, I thought knowing someone that had a firsthand Tony story, I couldn't pass it up.
I always admired him. You know, you got to admit his range in movies were amazing.
Incredible.
You know, in fact,
and his war story. I mean, just being within eye shot of the surrender of the Japanese is kind of an amazing story for a lifetime.
Well, like you said, I mean, and he was a real man's man. I mean, I don't know if that was his. Obviously, when The Great Race came out, that was his image. You know, he was the man's man. In fact, that was just on Turner the other day, The Great Race. And it's a corny movie in many ways, but it does show his versatility. You can see he's doing a lot of those stunts, so it's pretty cool.